episode of the Philosophical Gospel Podcast. I warmly welcome Mr. Brandon Dayton. He is the creator of The Green Monk, Blood of the Martyrs comic book, and it details the ongoings of a monastic monk and is his adventures and misadventures throughout that process. It's a beautiful rendition of the art of the Christian religion. There's a lot of symbology. It's a great book, and he gives us some insight into his creative process, how he got to where he is with his writing and with his creation, what his ideas are about how to encourage those who would like to create to bring script to screen, so to speak. And on top of that, we also discuss some of the nature of Carl Jung and some of the nature of religion in general. So I hope you guys very much enjoy this. Brandon has worked for quite some time in animation and concept art, including some design for Disney and EA games. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you.
Well, also, I wanted to say congratulations on the success that it's had too, as well. Just it seems to me like it's taken to a large niche of people. And I guess at the beginning I was talking about Brandon. Brandon is the creator of The Green Monk, and it is a comic series that he's released that details the ongoings of a monastic monk, and in the Christian tradition, seemingly. And so I wanted to start off by asking you about the creation of the archetype of the character of the warrior monk and where the inspiration came from.
Yeah, so it's something that goes back pretty far, like pretty early. I remember having it when I was still in going to college, kind of having the initial idea. And I've mentioned before, like there's even something about it that was a little bit like, in the wake of seeing like the Star Wars prequels, there was something to it where it's like, oh, what if I were to do my own Star Wars story and tell it the way that I would want to tell it, where it's like, okay, you have these like, Jedi and have these magical swords, and so it's like mine was gonna be something like that, and like instead of a lightsaber, it was going to be this like sword made out of a blade of grass. And then the initial versions of it were something like Miyazaki. Like I was going to have this version of like the Searchers, where he is in this town, and like the town gets raided while he's away, and he has to come back, and he's like searching for like his, trying to find someone that was kidnapped, like a sister or something, and there's going to be technology in it. Then after I saw Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, like I watched that, and after that I was like, oh, that's the setting I want to put this in. And that's really like, I think, where everything came together and where the story really started to kind of take on its own life. Yeah.
I see. Well, that it's fascinating to me because I had never had much former interest in comic books or graphic novels, really, and it was through symbology and kind of the introduction into the symbolic world, as Jonathan Pajot talks about a lot, and through his the Dog-Headed Saint book, and then arriving at yours, it's like there's a kind of an interesting transition between what the Western conception of a monk looks like versus the Eastern, but also just the coming together of symbology, like the icons and Russian Orthodoxy and things like that. And I kind of wanted it's steeped in some of those iconography type stuff in your Green Monk, and it's beautifully drawn, and I have a lot of impact personally on spirituality from the icon and from symbology. And I kind of wanted to ask, how was your weaving in of the symbology of some of these archetypes and these things was that a conscious thing, or did you kind of bring that in throughout kind of inadvertently?
Yeah. So for me, I was raised Mormon, but I left that faith. And so I'm not religious in that way, even though like I've kind of come to find a meaning and an identity in Mormonism that's kind of more idiosyncratic kind of to myself. So I would say that there wasn't this intentional, I didn't come to it intentionally with like, oh, hey, I love Christian symbolism and I want to tell a story about Christian symbolism. It was more like being led. It was more a feeling of being led there. I discovered Andrei Rublev, I had this story, and I've always resonated with monastic characters as well. So I'm always, there's, I believe it's Alexei is also the name of the youngest brother in Brothers Karamazov, that probably had an influence on that. I really love Black Robe, is one of my favorite movies, about a Catholic in the Americas. Canticle for Leibowitz is one of my favorite sci-fi story. I just find I've always resonated with those characters. And like as a young Mormon missionary, like I was a missionary, there's very much that experience, that it was like it's an ascetic experience.
Yeah.
And so there was something about just that archetype of like the monastic archetype, that is always really resonated. And I think that's really what drew me in, was that kind of archetype. And in the process, there was kind of this discovery of like Russian history and kind of this Eastern Orthodox way of looking at things. And so, yeah, that was kind of my way in. It was really, for me, it was really the sense of like, this feels very fresh. This feels like a world that like feels very unique and unexamined. Like so many people have done, the Shaolin monk, or, there's, I could have done it in that setting. And this setting just felt like so much more fresh and interesting. And it just felt like a wilderness, like this unexplored wilderness to me. And so that's what really drew me in, was like my curiosity with the uniqueness of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. It is kind of like an unexplored wilderness. I kind of like that comparison, because there's so much richness that can be had in the storytelling involving this archetype, particularly. And I wasn't even aware of monasticism or the monastic life up until about a year or two ago, and I took to the stories of somebody like Joan of Arc, who was a warrior female, and just thought, as I read through like Mark Twain's description of her life and his biography of her, sort of historical narrative of her, I kind of gravitated towards like, this needs to be portrayed in a way that's comic style. And then I saw your portrayal, and I kind of really led me in the way that, oh, there's a way you can be masculine and spiritual, or there's a way, if that makes any sense. And I wanted to ask maybe if that's something you kind of personally saw or intended to portray, but it certainly gives this beautiful retelling of what masculinity means in the frame of spirituality.
Yeah. So, geez, that's a really deep question for me. I think that's a wonderful question. So that's a very big theme. Like the heritage I come from with Mormonism, that's very big within Mormonism, where like masculinity and piety, for a better word, are very intertwined. So, and I come from a family where kind of very traditional, I think universal ideas of masculinity are part of what it means to be a man, where it's like you're a hard worker and you're strong and you have like your willpower and you support the family, but there's also this other part of like your duty to a faith and the commitment, and that like there's this masculinity in your obedience to a law, of like, oh, I keep this law to the letter. And there's kind of this like masculinity to that as well. And there are many figures within Mormon tradition that are warrior prophets. So the warrior prophet within Mormon tradition. So you have like, for example, people know about Angel Moroni, is kind of this prominent Mormon character, and Moroni was a warrior and a prophet. And you see that all throughout the Book of Mormon. You have these characters that are defenders, defending with weapons, but also have this like religious justification for what they were doing. So so it's very much part of like my background and my heritage, and it was very much a theme I was exploring within Green Monk, is like, what does masculinity mean? And this, along with this idea of authentic, like sincere desire for some sort of like spiritual, what would you call it, growth, development, awakening, something like that as well. Yeah.
Some type of asceticism that actually occurs, where you're actually, making a conscious ascent up this spiritual mountain. But that in itself becomes kind of like an integral aspect of the spiritual masculinity that I think is really well portrayed. And it seems too that there's like the internal struggle that kind of exists with the character, and the feminine character that's also in it, that's a little bit alarming and a little bit, it's kind of encouraging him to violate the laws, but at the same time, while by violating those laws, he's sustaining the monastery in a certain type of way. And so, speaking on the masculinity side of it, the feminine side of it is also robust. So I obviously saw a lot of parallels to the Christian story, but depicting feminine characters is something like I was mentioning Joan of Arc earlier. There's kind of like a conscious wave of that being done. What would you say the impact of the feminine is? It to balance out the masculine, or what was kind of your design behind the feminine depiction?
So yeah, that's another thing where I don't know if I had an intention. I didn't have an intentional plan. A lot of this stuff is stuff that's become more obvious as I look back at it. And it's very much a reflection of my own personal development. Having come from this very masculine, law-based religion, for me, as I left that religion of my birth, the feminine has become a much bigger part of my personal growth and spirituality. So part of that is reflecting that. One way I like to point it out is that all of my spiritual teachers I've had after leaving the LDS Church have all been women, almost with a few exceptions. And for people that don't know, within Mormonism, it's only men hold the priesthood, which gives you certain religious authorities. So women are restricted from certain leadership roles and certain types of teachings and ordinances and things like that. So yeah, there is kind of like, and I think that kind of was expressed within this story of Green Monk. I see it a lot as kind of like telling that same story. It's a story about coming out of a world that is a world of men, being led out of it by this feminine impulse, the creative impulse. And so yeah, that seems like a big part of it. And that matches my experience. That as I progress, I find it, and I'm still in this place in my life where I find feminine, the feminine field, like the creativity, exploration, feeling into things is what feels more right for me right now. And I don't mean to say that that's like the right thing to do for everyone, but that's kind of like, that's the place I am at more right now. So
no, that makes sense. And I like reading the works of Carl Jung, who had this idea of when you have this alchemy inside throughout a person's just regular psyche development, it's the anima and the animus kind of coming together, where I kind of noticed something similar to that kind of spring up in me when I started indulging into characters that were of the feminine nature of the Bible, which the Bible has like a story of in the beginning about Ruth, who is just a 4-chapter story, but it captures those intangible elements of the feminine that's not present in a male, the overt compassion, the kind of just warmth that comes from a female, but also how critical it is for like a male to understand what that is eventually. And it seems like it kind of grabs people at different times, like you're saying, where your future spiritual teachers were all female. Well, it's like there's really, well, if you're drawn to that kind of character's archetype of the female, it's necessary to work it into yourself almost.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a reflection of the interior. And I kind of have this like asterisk about like, when is like the masculine going to come back in, or do I need to like re-embrace that at some point? But currently for me, it doesn't feel like that. I actually had this question I asked myself the other day. I'm like, what does it mean for me to be masculine? Like, is that something that's important to me? And at least at present, I kind of am in this place where I'm like, I don't know if I need that if that's so important to my identity right now, which is interesting, because I think I've probably like pushed myself, and I'm willing to do more difficult things than I ever have in my life. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, but I do like that idea of like the balancing. You talk about Jung, and I've been reading some Jung lately, and I think that's a like very exciting idea, is like seeing sing both those things within myself, you know.
Yeah,
I'll say it
it's almost like, yeah, it's like an alchemical connection where you see that
yeah.
if they came together perfectly, that there could be a synthesis of the two. But it's like finding the legs for both at the same time is kind of an interesting endeavor, because you're like, well, should I be incorporating more of the King David into my personality, or more of this light,
Yeah.
warm-hearted, and that's another character that I found really unique in the Bible, was somebody like King David. And I think this world of portrayal of some of these like monastics, or some of these people who are spiritual, masculine, and also warriors, is, usually monks are portrayed as, which rightly so, I guess, in the East, as very nonviolent, pacifistic,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And it's more of a Western spin, maybe it seems like to me, that they're in action more. But I don't think it comes at any peril by any means. I think it might even be a great solution to some of the meaning elements that are in crisis for men. It's like, I hear this term a lot, meaning crisis, whatever that means. But I know for myself, I encountered that meaning crisis through experiences in my own life and things like that. And the monastic readings of monks, and then incorporated with the artwork of yourself, has added a whole nother element to me, to reading monastic literature, to find just personal spiritual meaning. You can see how men did that back then. You can see how they brought it into action in your story. And so I think it's such a deeper level than just your writing of the comic book or the design. It seems to me like people can start to view the masculine condition and the spiritual condition together. It's a warm synthesis of the two. And I think it might even be something that's very needed for people to be able to see that there's, just because you're a man, you're not useless. And also you can embrace these things in a way that's masculine appearing on the outside.
Yeah.
And so,
One thing that kind of like strikes me as you're talking about this is there is kind of these two, I'm going to say polarities, and maybe that's not the best word, but there is the monastic tradition of like removing yourself from the world, like detachment. And within like spiritual practice, there's this word sometimes they talk about like spiritual bypassing, where it's like you can become so detached from the world, so much like in heaven, you could say, that you're just watching the world pass you by and nothing bothers you, and you have this kind of like this equanimity to view everything. And then there's this other end extreme of it, which is, no, I'm going to enter into the world. I'm going to be part of the world as a choice. And this gets to like within Buddhism, you have like the Bodhisattva vow, which is like, okay, I could be an awakened being and I could just be like cool with everything and everything is love. But I also have this desire and this drive to enter into the world and to like end suffering for others. And it's also very much, that's a very Christian idea as well, right? God becoming flesh, that type of thing. So that like polarity, I think, is really interesting too. And I think that's part of it as well. Like the warrior deciding, no, I'm going to step into life and I'm going to live life. Is I think it's kind of a symbol of that as well.
Well said. Yeah, I think you're very spot on with the whole idea of selflessness that comes in the Buddhist style. At least speaking to that when I was progressing on the spiritual journey and ended up Orthodox Christianity, it started out with non-dual Advaita Vedanta Hindu practice, where I was attending Hindu temples. I was searching ultimately for the origin of malevolence, really, because I had an encounter with it that was really didn't fit my worldview, and kind of rocked how I saw the world, because I was a militantly angled atheist, and I basically made my MO the degradation of religion for some reason. And then I was shocked into the world of religion by having to reconcile malevolent behavior with my current atheist worldview. It was like there's no connection there, because there's this much bad, that, or at least how I interpreted it at the time, didn't seem good. Then how could there be no God? If there's that much evil, there has to be a God because of that, almost.
Dude, that's kind of almost a surprising way to look at it, that it is kind of this inverse of the problem of evil for you.
Yeah.
But the level of evil for you seemed to make you feel like it was more clear that there had to be a God.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So what was, can I ask you, I'm curious about that. What was it about that made you feel like?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to explain. It was I was like, right now I'm 27 years old, but about when I was 22, I entered into a relationship where that advanced pretty quickly. And for 4 or 5 years, that relationship turned to like a prison for me. To where I was a naive, kind of a gullible person who grew up without parental unit there at all. And so I got a job and everything. And then all of a sudden I felt like, the whole world's great. So if I find this person and I get in a relationship with them, why would they not just love me, kind of thing. And then it immediately, after about a year or two, turned into this like very subtle, covert pollution of my psyche, to where the religious attachments I had were made fun of. They were degraded. The relationships I had with others outside of that relationship were completely dismantled, because any interaction I had there and then it slowly became like a living kind of hell for me. But then it evolved into and that was even subtle in its own right, but it kind of evolved into a very physical, like, prevention of leaving this relationship. And I had no way to avoid it, but it turned so dark for me in several occasions to where it was almost like I cried out to God to be like, okay, I need to be delivered from this situation in some way, that eventually involved me leaving with just a very little of my things through a window, which is a weird way of doing it. And I don't say that for pity. I say that more like it relates back to a lot of archetypes to where people escape situations narrowly.
Sure.
And I took that as like, oh, after I got back on my feet and kind of absorbed all of that, I was like, how could a person inflict, when I was like, I know I have my agency in it. I know I put myself in the situation. I know I returned to, like a dog to its vomit, I returned back to its situation. But what in the hell did I do to deserve all of that other stuff? And then I realized, I had agency in it. I need to repent for what I've done wrong and also acknowledge my role in putting myself in the situation, but was still just impossibly unable to figure out, how could there be no God and somebody could actively will your destruction or actively will your degradation? And so that sparked in me, like, once I got out of that, it sparked in me nothing but a positive outlook at everything in a way that was, I would say, undeserved, because most people have to struggle for, 10, 15 years through therapists and counselors to be relinquished from some of this stuff. And I was redeemed from it or something. It just dropped off of my shoulders one day. And that was after going to Hindu temples. I thought maybe they had the answer to this malevolence. Then I thought maybe, and I was like, the Protestant tradition, no way, because I'd already been in that. I'd seen how that didn't answer much questions. And so I ended up at the Catholic Church, and then I ended up at the Orthodox Church, and started this podcast all as a result of that encounter, trying to get to the bottom of human consciousness and the origins of evil. And that's why the stories of like warrior monks to me are like, they don't complain, they accept responsibility, they go and attack the dragon at the gates of the city, and they do so without bitching about it. And it's kind of, and even having to have experienced evil or hard times, evil spirits, all those things, they don't shirk the responsibility of what it means to take action and take responsibility for your own choices, kind of thing. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that's very interesting to me. I mean, I've never really like thought about, because that's often the atheist position is kind of like, how can there be a God when there's so much evil?
Yeah.
But there is this kind of other version of it that's like, if you see hell up close, that also can be kind of like evidence that there's something deeper going on. It makes me think, I actually have this other story I've been working on where there's a religion of these characters, and their religion is that they believe in God. They're definitely theists, but they believe that the purpose of God is just to make humans suffer. Like that like humans are like this plaything for God, that he wants to make them suffer. And so their whole religion is based on like, we are going to do everything we can to like fight against like this deity that wants to make like life miserable for us. I don't know why that comes up for me as you're saying that, but
yeah, no, but that's how it feels in those situations. It's like a Book of Job situation where everybody around Job is kind of encouraging Job to curse God, because why has Job received all this unfair treatment? He's done nothing but been a pious man, but his lot has been completely dismantled. His kids have been completely struck down, and he's sitting there, scraping his skin with glass. And his wife is even coming up to him, telling him, why don't you just give up on this God? Look what he did to you. He's useless, And Job is like that quiet warrior who sits there despite all of his friends telling him why he should turn his back, his wife telling him all these things. And instead, Job continues to pay penance for what his role could have been in causing all that instead of shirking it. And Job is like a character that could even be really well portrayed in some way in modern times and modern era through art, I think, with a kind of like a monk and kind of like a person who, even though he wasn't a monk, he didn't follow all these ascetic practices and laws. He simply maintained a faith that was that was unknown to anybody around him, in spite of like his kids just being murdered, his livestock gone. He's just sitting there and everybody's telling him he's a piece of crap. And he's like, well, I don't think so. It's like, I don't think he's like, however the Lord giveth and he taketh away. And it's like an acceptance of, look, this is all fickle. I mean, you're given your lot, but it's all holy ground. It's not yours, not your ground kind of deal. So
yeah. I think like I feel like a theme here that seems really important to me is like the theme of like suffering and of hell. Like I'm thinking of two things that come up for me, and one is I remember Jordan Peterson saying this. I think someone else quoted him saying this, but basically said like, if you want to be happy, you don't do it by trying to find heaven. Like his reasoning is kind of like, we don't really, all of our ideas of like what heaven are kind of vague, but he's kind of like, but we definitely know what hell is. So if you can get further away from hell, then your chances are you're going to get closer to heaven, which also kind of like ties in with like Buddhist practices. Oh my gosh, there's a giant spider on my wall. But anyway, I mean, that's the way the Buddhism looks at it as well, is kind of like, let's look at suffering. Like, let's understand what suffering is. And I'm thinking about Job too. And it's like, I mean, that's what hell is. I mean, we experience hell as humans all the time through how we suffer. But the idea is like, oh, if you can overcome suffering, I mean, the rest takes care of itself, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me of, oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I don't know if I have anything else to say about that, but I do think that concept is interesting, like how we relate to suffering. And listening to your story about how like your encounter with suffering drove you into this direction, which I mean, that was my case too. Like for me, the path that I'm on currently was very much driven by dealing with depression all my life, like coming to like a midlife crisis, and then just being like so miserable that I'm just like, I've got to do something. I've got to do something, you know? And for me, it ended up being the pathway for me started with like meditation. Like I started doing meditation, you know, based on like Buddhist practices. And that's where things started opening up for me, where it was like, okay. And again, it's this idea of like, you're talking about, what does the warrior monk do? The warrior monk like goes out and faces the scary thing and goes and fights the dragon. And so this turn for me that was important was like, all right, I need to turn around and face everything that I've avoided all my life. And that was really at the core of my depression, you know? It's like, I'm going to turn around and face this stuff and just get intimate with it and know it backwards and forwards. Yeah. And that's a process I'm continuing to this day, you know?
Absolutely. It's a hard one to know how to attack too. It doesn't have a field guide handed to you from any one person that tells you how to go through that process.
Yeah.
And when I've sympathized, or not sympathized, but I have a parallel with you in the sense that going into Buddhist meditation and doing that non-dual type thing where it seemed like as I began to embrace that practice, likewise did I begin to try to understand their teachings better at the same time. And what happened was like seeing their teachings almost like the dissolution of the self was at the core of their antidote to suffering. And I just didn't like that, because the more I wanted to intellectualize the teachings alongside the practice, the more I got to where I felt like life was nothing but a video game. And and it was weird, because it was almost like I was really embodying these virtues. I was like, okay, I need the answer to this malevolence. I need to follow a practice that works. These guys seem to have it. And then I started embodying it, started reading the teaching so much so that I was like, okay, I don't like the dissolution of self that's trying to be encouraged here, and the dissolution of almost free agency too that comes along with that. And it almost encouraged, like you had mentioned earlier, like a withdrawal out of the world, less than a bodhisattva, like coming into the world and impacting it because of your learned knowledge. And kind of just curiously makes me want to ask you, did you have any episodes or any encounters with the Buddhist teachings that kind of were off-putting to you in the sense that the self and being an illusion almost was kind of not the right way to address suffering?
Yeah, so that's yeah, let me think about that a little bit, because my general feeling about Buddhism, I've used this metaphor before, that I kind of feel like it feels to me like a good Samaritan. That was kind of my experience with it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't consider myself Buddhist. I don't identify with that, but my experience has mostly been I would say positive.
Yeah.
I would say the one thing that maybe I rubbed up against was like, so I had these really powerful experiences with meditation where I was like, kind of feeling this relief from suffering that I've had for a long time. And the conclusion initially I was kind of considering was like, oh geez, well, I'm doing this stuff that comes from Buddhist practices. Like, maybe I need to become Buddhist, you know? And
Yeah.
there's this very interesting within even kind of secular meditation culture within the West. There is kind of this like deference to kind of Buddhist authority. This kind of like people that are neuroscientists that are into meditation, they'll like give some sort of like special deference to authority figures like the Dalai Lama or something like that, just for being authority figures within this tradition. And I noticed that I didn't like, I kind of played at the edges of that, but I noticed I didn't like the idea of belonging to some other orthodoxy. That there is like, there's these practices that I very much appreciate that are rich and wonderful, but then like the orthodoxy of like, do I want to be part of a tradition? Like, I noticed that I didn't really want that. So, but I do have this I have this reverence for the Buddhist tradition and what they've carried and given to the world. But as far as like self goes, I think that's interesting. You talk about like disillusion of the self, and I do think there are some Buddhist traditions that look at awakening as a process of making the self disappear.
Yes.
And I prefer the way that I think about it now is that it's more about seeing that the self is a creation. I mean, you can call it like an artistic creation, or it's a role that you play. So there's a particular practice I actually do called soul making dharma that I really like their approach, and they use the word theatricality, and it isn't just about the self.
That's good.
It's about the way we perceive everything. Everything is fabricated by how we interact with it and how we look at it. And so that's kind of how I look at it. It isn't so much that the self disappears, but that I see that the self is something that is moldable and shapeable, it serves a function. I mean, to the degree that it suffers, then I can change it and open it up and let it be something different. I don't know if that. So that's kind of how I see it. I see it as like, I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. That's a very I like that a lot, because it really is just about how you frame that doctrine or those teachings, because it could just as easily be, like I said it, this doom and gloom, dissolution of self, or it could easily be just as you framed it, which is it's a seeing through the veil experience more so. It's a summer home, not a place you move into permanently. As a guest of mine previously said, they were speaking on the soul making dharmas particularly, or something similar to that.
How cool.
They were speaking on that, and the idea of meta meditation, which is loving kindness, which is visualization. And that's one I pay a lot of respect to the tradition of Buddhism as well. And so I think it's nice to have someone remind me that that's not the teaching. That is what you interpreted the teaching to mean. And I think that seeing through that veil process and all that is deeply invigorated into the Christian contemplative tradition too. Like a lot of the writings of Catholic Church Fathers and Orthodox Church Fathers indicate always about the false self and the ego, and in the true sense of dissolving the false self, but retaining the true self. And that's a Buddhist-esque teaching, but it's deeply entrenched into the monastic tradition of Orthodoxy and Catholicism, the Trappist monks. And I think in the West, there's been this complete, maybe not the best thing, but it's been like this forgetfulness of the fact that Christianity even has a contemplative practice at all, it's even embedded into the structure of anything. Like, and it truly is. It's been that saved a lot of Western culture, is the monks in the early ages translating, and the scribes keeping apart all these documents that represented the world history. I mean, they were like Franciscan monks were responsible for like saving 80% of Roman history because they sat there all day and translated it and reproduced these writings. And so a neat thing about your work is that at least it shows people that there is this alternative besides the Kung Fu monk that exists, what its purpose is, and you beautifully depict it. And so one of the things I wanted to get to is just, you mentioned kind of having one foot in hell to see heaven and things like that. There's this ancient Renaissance art that depicts, I think it's the Virgin Mary, or no, it might be Eve, might be what the feminine character with her foot on the serpent and her head in the clouds kind of thing. And it's this recurring Renaissance pattern of art that I found to be very unique, because it's kind of like the Carl Jung thing where he said that, in order to see heaven, one must have one foot firmly planted in hell. It's kind of that same symbology, that it's like you've got to have your foot constantly on the serpent and also looking at it, but also your head. In order for your head to be in the clouds, you have to recognize the serpent's there. Otherwise he'll steal heaven.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And
yeah,
so,
I mean, I absolutely relate to that. That's something that I feel like I've experienced in my own practice, has been like the more I've made room for, as far as like my own suffering, the things that are difficult, the more I make space for, like the more capacity I also have for love and happiness and those type of things as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think some of that, the recurring themes of just art, and through that art, something was about myself was that I was always a person of words and literature and math and science. And so coming into this field of art has made me, as it's kind of slowly created itself a little bit. Some of the things that I've done, like my podcast was a big endeavor, but I never intended to name it. It's like it almost named itself. Its logo created itself. It's like when I look back on this creative process, I see it as kind of like I don't have much of a hand to play or much of an egoic attachment to it. And that doesn't mean that I put my heart and soul into it in a way, but it's almost effortless. And that doesn't mean anything to my credit. It more or less means there's something unique about the creative process that was awakened in somebody like myself through this experience too, because it was like, there's a creative process where you almost have to put the pedal to the metal and put your work into it, but then you also have to let off of it. And you don't know, there's no formula for how to conduct that process. And so I kind of getting, not to keep you too much longer, but I know you have some work on your YouTube channel that is kind of like helping people bring script to screen, or being, so to speak, or helping the creative process along. I think that's really cool. And so just towards the end of this interview, I wanted to ask you about your goals with that, and how you see teaching the creative process and what that looks like to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, like if you look at my YouTube channel, I would really kind of describe that as like, you can see me in the process of figuring out some sort of problem. That's how I would describe it. And it is me kind of trying to share things, but it was very much me trying to like figure out kind of a question of like what it means to make art. And again, this gets to like the masculine and feminine, like feeling this like tension between like feeling like this obligation, or there's this kind of like weight of like feeling like I had to fit this role of what it meant to be an artist, but slowly kind of discovering that actually being an artist meant kind of like letting go of that role and kind of having more of this openness to the creative process. So it's actually been how long has it been since I last did a video? It's been a little over a year since I last did a video on my YouTube channel. So what I'm really working on right now, my project right now has been, I'm working on organizing what I would call like a creative community of practice. And it's composed of people locally and also like that connect remotely. And I'm very curious about like, I don't know if you follow like John Vervaeke at all.
Yeah.
And he talks about like ecology of practices. And so it's been my way of kind of like looking at experimenting with a specific ecology practice for myself, for those that I'm connected to. And this question of like, what generates creativity? What generates these like flow experiences? and I'm very drawn to this idea of like collective creativity and collective flow. So that's really the project I've been working on most lately, and I hope to actually make some art within the midst of it too. I've been working a lot on like organizing and putting together events and things like that.
Well, that's excellent, and I'm grateful to have the pleasure of chatting with you, because I am looking forward to your future work. I know you mentioned there may not be a sequel to this one, but even if not, I'm sure there'll be more creative juices flowing. But I wanted to say it just in conclusion, your work is in the Green Monk is beautiful. It's meant a lot to me coming to see your interview with Peugeot, to having read it, to having seen the connection between it and the comic. And I think it's a treasure really, for a lot of people to come looking into. So I hope that others find it as well. And I wanted to just end with that and say thank you again for your time and joining me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Ethan. It's been nice chatting.
Absolutely. Well, I'll keep in touch with you, Brandon, and you have a nice rest of your day.
All right. Take care, man.
Take care.